Warner Brothers built The Adventures of Don Juan with more than 5,200 costumes and 113 sets. And then they cheated. According to AFI, they spliced in stock shots from earlier Errol Flynn classics. Why build a movie that big and still reach backward? Because this was never about Don Juan. It was about reaching for the old Flynn spell. The strange thing about The Adventures of Don Juan is that it feels both inevitable and late. Errol Flynn as Don Juan? Of course. By the late 1940s, Flynn had already become one of Hollywood's great adventure icons. Captain Blood made him a star, The Adventures of Robin Hood had turned him into a myth, the Seahawk had confirmed him as the screen's laughing, sword-swinging romantic hero. The sword, the smirk, the cape. That easy grin that seemed to say he had already won before the duel even started. That was not just a performance anymore. That was part of movie history. Turner Classic Movies notes that Warner Brothers wanted to take advantage of Flynn's public image as Hollywood's great Don Juan. And that is key to the film. The studio was not simply casting a character, it was calling back an entire feeling. Audiences knew what Flynn meant. They knew the lift of his chin, the flash of the blade, the mix of danger and charm. They came not just for a plot, but for the experience of Errol Flynn in full romantic adventure mode. But timing gives this movie its tension. This was not Flynn at the beginning of his swashbuckling journey. This was Flynn after the great 1930s triumphs. After years of fame, after audiences had already built a deep affection for the kind of hero only he could play. That does not make the film sad, it makes it richer. Because Adventures of Don Juan is not asking us to meet Flynn for the first time. It is inviting us to meet him again, with history behind him, with the audience already on his side, and with a studio willing to dress that reunion in color, music, and velvet. And even getting the film to the screen took time. According to AFI, Warner Brothers had been developing a Don Juan project for Flynn earlier in the decade, with production once expected around the mid-40s, but delays, script work, production changes, and industry complications kept pushing it back. Often associated with 1948 because of its production and copyright year, The Adventures of Don Juan reached U.S. audiences in early 1949 when Hollywood itself was changing. The timing gives it a special place. Had it arrived during Flynn's blazing prime, it might have felt like a coronation. Arriving later, it feels like a grand return, still dazzling but now touched with memory. And Warner Brothers did not make that return small. AFI's production details tell us this was not a modest comeback vehicle. Those thousands of costumes and scores of sets were Warner Brothers working at full old studio strength, building a world grand enough to let Flynn and his audience step back into the magic together, if only for a little while. That is why the stock footage detail matters. At moments, the movie reaches backward into Flynn's earlier films to create its own glow. The past is not just remembered, it is spliced into the present. In a way, Warner Brothers edited nostalgia directly into the movie, and that is the real story hiding inside the spectacle. The Adventures of Don Juan was not only about a famous lover at court, it was about a studio gathering every tool it had. Costume sets, music, color, editing, memory, to let audiences experience the Errol Flynn adventure one more time. But to do that, they needed more than spectacle. They needed the man inside the cape. The great charm of The Adventures of Don Juan is that Flynn fits the role perfectly, and then gives it more than the title promises. On paper, no one made more sense. Flynn had elegance, mischief, confidence, and that wonderful ability to make danger look like a private joke. The audience did not need to be convinced that he could play a man who leaves romantic chaos wherever he goes. They already knew. But the movie is smarter than simply saying, here he is again. It opens with Don Juan as a man whose romantic adventures have become an international problem. He is not merely flirting, he is creating diplomatic damage. It is funny, bright, and very Flynn. But beneath the comedy is a sharper idea. Don Juan is surrounded by expectations. Every woman expects conquest. Every man expects trouble. Every court expects scandal. And then the movie asks whether he can become something more useful than his reputation. That is where director Vincent Sherman becomes important. Sherman was not Michael Curtiz, the director most associated with Flynn's great early swashbuckling triumphs. He was not Raoul Walsh, who had directed Flynn and They Died with Their Boots On, and Gentleman Jim. AFI notes that Walsh and Jean Negulesco were both connected to the Don Juan project before Sherman directed it, and that Sherman was assigned after Flynn requested him. That gives the film a different flavor. A Curtiz version might have had sharper shadows and harder adventure momentum. A Walsh version might have had more muscle and swagger. Sherman's Don Juan is smoother, more courtly, more romantic, and more reflective. It gives Flynn room not just to leap, but to pause. And that pause is part of the pleasure. This is not young Flynn proving he can be brave. This is seasoned Flynn discovering that charm can grow into honor. And the cast gives him exactly the world he needs. Vivica Lindfors is Queen Margaret, not another conquest, but the one woman Don Juan cannot pursue without becoming less noble than he wants to be. Robert Douglas is Duke de Lorca, a villain in silk instead of armor. He does not need to roar. He can threaten the kingdom with a whisper. And then there is Alan Hale as Leporello. Familiar, funny, royal, and for Flynn fans, almost like seeing an old friend step through the palace doors. That matters because this movie is not just built from costumes and sets, it is built from faces we trust. The smaller roles sparkle too. Anne Rutherford, Una O'Connor, Romney Brent, Robert Warwick, and Raymond Burr years before television made him into Perry Mason. That is the pleasure of a studio-era picture like this. Even the side doors of the palace opened into familiar faces. Now, was the production easy? No. AFI records that filming shut down in January 1948 when Flynn developed influenza. Later accounts, including Turner Classic Movies, also note the production's physical demands and the use of doubling for some of the action. But old Hollywood was always collaborative. Stars mattered deeply. But so did stunt performers, editors, directors, cinematographers, costumers, musicians, and crews who knew how to make an adventure feel effortless. Flynn still had the presence. The cape still fits, the smile still works, the sword still flashes. But now we can see the full machine around him. The studio team working with a beloved star to create the experience audiences came for. So which Flynn do we get in the Adventures of Don Juan? The laughing lover? The seasoned professional? The romantic hero audiences still wanted to cheer? Maybe the answer is all three. And that is why the film has more emotional texture than its title suggests. It is selling romance, but it is also giving Flynn a chance to play the rogue with a little more wisdom. And then the movie does something quietly wonderful. It makes Don Juan's greatest victory the one thing his reputation never promised: restraint. The poster promises Errol Flynn is the world's most famous lover, and the movie gives you that pleasure. There are disguises, duels, jealous men, palace corridors, romantic misunderstandings, and Flynn moving through it all with that unmistakable mixture of mischief and elegance. But the real surprise is that The Adventures of Don Juan is not finally about conquest, it is about restraint. Don Juan begins as a man who cannot resist romance, but the film's emotional test is whether he can resist the one romance that would flatter him most. Queen Margaret is beautiful, but she is more than beautiful. She represents duty, honor, and the stability of Spain. Don Juan's love for her may be real, but if he pursues it selfishly, he damages the very woman he claims to adore. So for once, winning would not be romantic. Winning would be wrong. That gives the story a more mature shape than the title suggests. Don Juan must move from appetite to loyalty, from performance to responsibility, from being admired to being worthy of admiration. The film also changes the stakes around him. He is not just a lover hiding from scandal, he becomes a man who uncovers treason. Duke de Lorca's plot pushes the story away from bedroom comedy and toward palace intrigue. Spain itself becomes part of the emotional test. The great romantic troublemaker has to become useful. That is a very old Hollywood transformation. The rogue discovers honor, the flirt discovers sacrifice, and the man everyone underestimates becomes the one person who sees the danger clearly. For Flynn, that refrain carries extra warmth. Audiences came to see the Flynn they loved. The bright Technicolor swordsman, the quick smile, the man who seemed born for danger and romance. And the film gives them that, but it also gives them something more seasoned. It gives them Flynn playing a man who does not have to win every heart to prove he is still the hero. And that is why the ending matters so much. Don Juan does not simply get the queen and ride off into a painted sunset. He chooses not to take what he wants. For a character defined by pursuit, that is a surprisingly noble turn. And for Flynn, it becomes quietly beautiful. The man famous for playing romantic adventurers gives one of his great later swashbuckling heroes an ending built not on possession, but on honor. That is why the film still plays today as more than a beautiful costume picture. Yes, some of the romantic comedy belongs very much to its time. Yes, the history is Hollywood fantasy rather than a classroom lesson. And yes, this is not the lightning in a bottle triumph of the Adventures of Robin Hood. But that is not the right comparison. The Adventures of Don Juan is not Flynn at the beginning of the fairy tale. It is Flynn returning after the fairy tale has already made him famous. Once you watch it that way, the movie becomes richer, warmer, and more rewarding. The story is not asking whether Don Juan can win every heart in Spain. It is asking whether he can finally master his own. And Warner Brothers gives that emotional idea the full palace treatment. By this point, the costumes and sets are no longer just production facts. They are the world of the movie. Official Oscar records show that Leah Rhodes, Travilla, and Marjorie Best won the Academy Award for Best Costume Design Color. The film was also nominated for art direction, set decoration, and a color picture. So when the movie looks magnificent, that is not accident, that is the point. The Queen's gowns give the palace its grace. De Lorca's wardrobe turns villainy into silk and shadow. Alan Hale's costumes keep the comedy broad, warm, and familiar. The sets give that world walls, staircases, balconies, and palace doors. Max Steiner's music sweeps in like a royal procession, giving every entrance more lift, every duel more urgency, and every romantic glance a little more moonlight. Then Elwood Bridell's Technicolor turns the whole thing into a moving jewel box. Velvet seems richer, candlelight feels warmer, the palace halls do not just look decorated, they seem enchanted. And just when the movie has wrapped you in all that color and music, it gives you the flash of steel. Turner Classic Movies notes that future Tarzan actor Jack Mahoney reportedly doubled Flynn for the dramatic staircase leap during the climactic duel. That detail does not diminish the action. It shows how movie magic is made. There is also one myth worth handling carefully. Because Flynn had a famous reputation as a romantic rogue, people sometimes treat Adventures of Don Juan as if he were simply playing himself. But that is too easy. Yes, Warner Brothers was clearly playing with Flynn's public image. Yes, the role winks at the reputation, and yes, audiences would have understood the connection. But Don Juan is still a crafted studio character inside a fictional swashbuckler. The movie does not prove Flynn was Don Juan. It shows how Warner Brothers built a palace around the idea of Flynn, and then asked the director to bring it to life. That is more interesting than gossip. That is Hollywood image making in full color. And all of it, the costumes, the music, the color, the staircase duel, even those echoes from Flynn's earlier films, leads to one quiet surprise. The movie does not end by proving Don Juan can win every woman. It ends by proving he can walk away from the one he truly wants. That is what gives the picture its unexpected grace. After all the velvet, all the swordplay, all the palace intrigue, Flynn's most heroic moment is not a leap, a kiss, or a victory pose. It is restraint. He does not leave the story defeated. He leaves it larger. Not because he gets everything, because at last he knows what must be honored. And for a moment, with the music rising and the palace still glowing around him, the old Flynn magic feels very much alive. So what is the Adventures of Don Juan in the end? It is not just a swashbuckler, it is not just Errol Flynn in a cape, it is Warner Brothers inviting Flynn and his audience back into the adventure. The music, the color, the swordplay, the palace intrigue, the loyal sidekick, the wicked villain, and that famous Flynn smile that made danger look like a dance. But behind the glamour is something even better than nostalgia. The studio was not asking us to forget the years. It was giving us a later chapter. A richer chapter. A chapter where the world's most famous lover discovers honor, maturity, and the grace of letting go. That is why The Adventures of Don Juan still matters. It is not Flynn's first great leap into legend. It is one of the most beautiful returns to it. And here at Flashback Rewind, we never give up on our heroes. We follow them into the later chapters, where the sparkle may be different, but the magic is still there. So tell me, does The Adventures of Don Juan deserve a bigger place in Errol Flynn's career? Or will Robin Hood, Captain Blood, and the Seahawk always steal the spotlight? Drop it in the comments. And if you love old Hollywood glamour, classic film surprises, and the stories hiding behind the sparkle, subscribe to Flashback Rewind, where nostalgia never grows old.